Good morning. It is a brisk Sunday morning here in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. We got our first snowfall last night. Roads were a little bit slick getting up here this morning, but not too bad. Hope everyone is doing well. This morning we are going to be continuing in our walk through the Gospel of Mark. This morning we'll be finishing up chapter 2 and going through chapter 3, verse 6. So what we have seen previously, we're early in Jesus' ministry. Last week we saw that Jesus was questioned about why his disciples were not fasting. Fasting was something that the disciples of John were doing. And it says that the disciples of the Pharisees were fasting. And Jesus goes on to make some comparisons and pronouncements as to why his followers were not fasting. And while fasting was an important topic to the Pharisees, they even more so were concerned with the Sabbath. And so we're going to be looking at two occurrences here that are consecutive in the Gospel of Mark, where the Sabbath starts to take center stage in the line of questioning and the growing hostility that we see with the Pharisees as they continue to question Jesus and start to build up in their minds, in their hearts, this agenda to try to get rid of him, which we will see start to unfold. So we'll finish up chapter 2 first, and I'm switching it up a little bit this morning. I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Chapter 2, verse 23, it says, "One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" So harvesting grain is not what they're getting at. So we take what we see there. The disciples were grabbing grain with their hands along the way as they were traveling. If we look at Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, that is something that is permissible. So they're not getting onto the disciples for that practice. What we see there in Deuteronomy is that it's permissible to harvest with your hands, as people are traveling, to be able to grab a little bit to munch on while they're walking. But if you were to take a sickle and start to harvest the grain, then you're getting into territory where you're doing something that is impermissible. But what we see here is they are not happy that the disciples are doing this on the Sabbath. And so then what is going to happen? Jesus is going to make a comparison of something that is not the exact same, but is similar in that it breaks ceremonial law. So the issue was doing this on the Sabbath. Now, if you see on the side there, I've got some references. If you want to pause and turn to those, you can. A few from Exodus, one from Leviticus, 1 Samuel, which is where Jesus is drawing this comparison from. But what we see is that David, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 6, says, David came to Nob to the priest Ahimelech. Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, Why are you alone and no one with you? David said to the priest Ahimelech, The king has charged me with a matter, and said to me, No one must know anything of the matter about which I send you, and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what have you at hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here. The priest answered David, I have no ordinary bread at hand, only holy bread, provided that the young men have kept themselves from women. David answered the priest, Indeed, women have been kept from us, as always, when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is a common journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there except the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. I'm not going to read the Exodus verses. You can look at those if you want. But they're just mentioning the bread of the presence. Now, Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 to 9, says, You shall take choice flour and bake 12 loaves of it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each loaf. You shall place them in 2 rows, 6 in a row, on the table of pure gold. You shall put frankincense with each row to be a token offering for the bread, as an offering by fire to the Lord. Every Sabbath day, Aaron shall set them in order before the Lord regularly, as a commitment of the people of Israel, as a covenant forever. They shall be for Aaron and his descendants, who shall eat them in a holy place, for they are most holy portions for him from the offerings by fire to the Lord, a perpetual due. So what do we see here? David is breaking the law. He's ignoring the guidance that is given there in Leviticus. He takes the bread that is supposed to be only for the priest's consumption. And the priest, Abiathar, he gives David this without much of a fuss. He does ask him some questions. But he goes along with it. So David is not condemned for breaking the law here. So what we see Jesus doing here is making this comparison that he's making this point that some violations of the law, of the ceremonial law, can be warranted. We get into that nuance of looking at the letter of the law versus the intent of the law. And the Pharisees were very much concerned with the letter of the law. And really, they had their own rabbinical law, even, that they had that went along with the law that kind of added more restrictions. But Jesus is saying, look, they're grabbing something to eat while they are walking. They needed food. They're hungry. So we're going to deprive nutrition. What really is more work? Would it be more work to go a Sabbath day's journey from wherever they were? The Sabbath day's journey, they could go about a half a mile. Walk in a half a mile or even a quarter of a mile, I think, is probably more work even than taking a few pieces of grain and eating them while you are walking. Jesus is saying this is kind of ridiculous. I wanted to read from the Expositor's Bible Commentary. This is the abridged edition for the New Testament. It says, "To Jesus, the Sabbath was not created for its own sake, gift of God to the human race. Its purpose was not to put humans in a kind of straitjacket. Rather, it was for their good, to provide rest from labor and opportunity for worship. And so we get to that line that it talks about where Jesus is saying, the Sabbath was made for mankind, for humankind. Not humankind, not mankind, for the Sabbath. So, thinking back to Genesis, when we look at the creation narrative, 6 days God is at work. Now, God doesn't need to rest, but what God does is he ceases from rest and takes time to just take it all in, to look upon his creation. We're created in God's image, and the image that we get of God is that he ceased from work. But he did not cease from being active and present. And if something had occurred on that 6th day, I'm sure if there was something that required his intervention, that he would have stepped in and done something. The Sabbath is supposed to be a day that is designed to cease from labor, to cease from our regular daily duties, and to take time to reflect, to seek God, to worship God, to think about God. So these restrictions on the Sabbath and working on the Sabbath, it's not because doing this little thing is bad. It's because we as people, what are we going to do? We're going to start doing one thing and we're going to get busy doing another and another and another. And it's good to have a day where, look, we're not going to get bogged down with all that stuff. We're going to have a day that is set aside as holy so that we can enter into God's presence. If you're thinking of the ceremonial days of the law, or to come to synagogue, as is the custom here in the time of Jesus. Or now we observe worship on Sunday mornings typically as Christians. Doesn't mean that your Sabbath has to be a Sunday. And we're not talking about a Sabbath in a legalistic sense. But it's good to have a day of rest, a day of refreshing, a day of renewal, a day of being able to recharge, to focus on God's Word, perhaps to be energized or to be strengthened by meeting with fellow believers, hearing the Word of God. Perhaps having that is then the basis for the following week. You have something to think about and relate to your day-to-day walk as you serve God in your normal day-to-day activities. So Jesus is saying the Sabbath was made to be a blessing to humankind, to be a blessing to man, to be a blessing to cease from distractions, because it is a tremendous blessing to be reminded of God and to draw into his presence and to seek him. And that's the thing. It's not supposed to hamstring us into not being able to do good things. And we see here that this does not satisfy the Pharisees. They'll be moving along. Now, this occurrence here, we don't know if this is consecutive. We don't know if they're grabbing grain on the way to this particular synagogue. But what we do see is that Jesus is going to the synagogue. It is the Sabbath. Verse 1 of chapter 3. Verse 1 of chapter 3, it says, "Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand." Verse 2, "They watched to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him." Let's stop there. So there was a rabbinic law, rabbinic tradition that it was permissible to help someone to heal someone if their life was in jeopardy. If there was a chance that they could die from whatever was ailing them, then it was permissible to go out of your way on the Sabbath to do that. Having a withered hand, a inability to use your hand is not going to meet that criteria. And so presumably they're knowledgeable of this individual that goes to this particular synagogue. And so essentially they're spying. They're trying to lay a trap to see if Jesus is going to intervene. They know that he has been doing these works. There's no denying that Jesus has this power of healing. And yet the Pharisees, they're seeing this power, and yet they're still opposed to Jesus because he doesn't fit into their box of what they think a rabbi, a good teacher is supposed to be doing. He is not adhering to this ceremonial law. So it says they watched him to see whether they would cure him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And so what we really are seeing is that, of course, Jesus, being in tune with the Spirit of God flowing through him, he perceives what is going on in their minds. And he says to the man with the withered hand, "Come forward." And so we don't know if this is something that this guy has been dealing with his entire life. We don't know if maybe his hand was crushed in a work accident. Maybe it was crushed by an animal being stubborn. We don't really know. But he tells him to come forward, and then he says to him, "Is it lawful," or he says to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?" But they were silent. And with these ruminations that they have of trying to get rid of Jesus, maybe even to the point of how could we kill Jesus? Is that rumbling around in their minds at this point? How could we have him taken out? This perceived in them. And so when he's talking about this idea of doing good or doing harm, I mean, one could say that these best laid plans that they're trying to come up with, I mean, could that in turn violate the Sabbath? Yeah, probably not. But they are conniving. They are scheming. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? Thinking this reminds me a little bit of Jesus' illustration of the Good Samaritan. The Levite walks by. Two guys walk by, and yet they don't want to help because, what justifications are they making? Well, it's the Sabbath, or maybe it's not the Sabbath, but maybe I'm on my way to do something, and if I were to touch this man, I would be, I touch his blood, or I'd be ceremonially unclean. Whatever the case is, they're making these justifications why I shouldn't help someone. And what we see in Jesus is, no, that's not how it's supposed to be. It's absolutely not how it is supposed to be. If you can do a good work like this, it's okay to set aside that ceremonial law, to do good to someone, to take care of someone. So in verse 5 it says, "He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at the hardness of heart and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was restored." And so it says that Jesus looks around with them in anger. What we see here is Jesus, he has this, we get this sense of righteous indignation. He's seeing the hardness of their hearts. He's seeing their lack of understanding that it is good to do good things, that healing is a good thing. And they can't see past this tiny keyhole of what they can see through the lens of the law into God's bigger picture, and what Jesus is doing with God's big picture in mind. And it's interesting, the Apostle Paul will write later, and I don't have it and the PowerPoint there. But Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, this is from the New Living Translation, says, "So don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days, or new moon ceremonies, or Sabbaths. For these rules are only shadows of the reality yet to come, and Christ himself is that reality." So the law is not the end-all, be-all. It was a shadow for what is to come, the shadow for what ends up being fulfilled in Christ. The law is pointing to him. The law was pointing, it was trying to bridge the gap between God and man. God makes this law so that people will be drawn near to him through their adherence to the law. It's not that adhering to the law makes one righteous or brings one to God in and of itself. It's the end result of the things that the law talks about, the things that the law is a shadow over. Those are the things that make one right, bring someone into a place where they can meet God. And Jesus is saying that these things in the ceremonial law, they had their place, they have their purpose, but they're not the most important thing. So what do we see Jesus doing? Jesus is placing love and compassion over the ceremonial law. Don't break the ceremonial law just for the sake of breaking the ceremonial law, but in the case of healing this guy on the Sabbath, go back to when Jesus heals the leper. Jesus is fine making himself ceremonially unclean, as the law would have suggested, to touch his hand on the leper and to make him well. Jesus says love and compassion trump the ceremonial law. Now that's the ceremonial law. Jesus is not going to call us to break the moral law. He's not going to do that. We see throughout Jesus' teachings that there are things to do that are right, and there are things to do that are wrong. And so, in some instances, Jesus makes things harder than the law would. We're told, in the law, not to harm your neighbor. Don't commit murder. And what does Jesus say? He's like, don't even harbor hatred in your heart, because you might as well have killed someone. You killed your neighbor. We're not ever going to be called to break a moral law to do what Jesus is doing here. It's not the same thing. We're never going to be able to say, well, I'm committing adultery so that I can show love and compassion. That's not going to happen, right? That is sin. There's no excuse for that. We're not going to be, committing adultery and saying, that's what I already said, idolatry. Jesus isn't going to say it's okay to worship an idol in this situation so that you can do something nice for someone. No, that's not what Jesus is getting at. It's two distinct things. There's the moral law. There's this ceremonial law. So what can we draw from this? Well, we think, hey, there are certainly going to be times when I might need to break some sort of statute and be willing to break some sort of statute to do something that is good or to do something that is right. It is quite possible and probable that some government somewhere at any given time has some laws on the books that are going to be problematic. I think of Nazi Germany. If they're going around trying to round up all the Jews and they're coming to your door and asking, are you harboring any Jews? Okay, what's the law of the land? What's the statute? Well, maybe it is you need to let us know if you've encountered anyone that fits that description. And you know what? I think the moral thing to do would be to say no. Nope, don't see any Jews around. Now, would there be things that we might be perfectly within our right to do, or perfectly reasonable to say, I'm going to ignore this law or statute in terms of what we're looking at today? The one I was thinking of, if I need to get to urgent care, like if we're at home and one of the kids looks like they broke their leg or something, or they have a head wound. You know what? I'm 5 miles or less from the nearest hospital. You know what? If I go 5 to 10 miles an hour over the speed limit and, I can do so without causing issue, I'm going to do that. I don't care about the speed limit. What I care about is getting my child to the emergency room or to urgent care. There's certain things like that, yes, this is a statute. Is it immoral to speed? I don't think so necessarily, other than, we're supposed to obey the law of the land, okay? But we have, there's penalties in place if you do that and get caught. Whatever. Something I'm perfectly fine getting a ticket if it means, need to get to the hospital quick. And hopefully, if I get pulled over and tell that officer, hey, can you give me an escort? I need to get my child to the emergency room. It's like, you can write me a ticket after that. That's fine. But we need to be looking at, where are we willing to say, okay, I can step outside of what these expectations are, because while I am trying to live a life void of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not trying to live as a charlatan or someone that's lawless. Try to follow the laws as long as they don't cause me to violate my conscience. But we need to look and see what are those lines that we're willing to step across to help someone. I think of if there's a no trespassing sign and somebody is on the other side of that no trespassing sign, what do? Do you say, nope, can't help you because you're on the other side of that trespassing sign? Seems like something that would be in line with what the Pharisees were doing. On the flip side, I think sometimes it's easy to be a little bit too careless. We say, oh, well, I have grace, so it doesn't matter if I step over the line. No, there's a difference between stepping over the line for the sake of love and compassion, stepping over the line of one of these statutory or ceremonial kind of laws. I think sometimes we might be a little bit too accommodating to our desires, too accommodating to what others might think. And so we're like, all right, well, I'm going to engage in some of these practices because you know what, it doesn't really matter. Or I'm going to rely on grace. Well, what does Paul say? Don't sin so that grace may abound. Again, we're not given liberty to forsake living holy lifestyles. We're just not. So we have to look at these distinctions and these lines that are drawn. Where is Jesus willing to step over the line? And where does Jesus hold fast? And think of these things in terms of maybe the way that punishments are doled out. There are certainly discrepancies sometimes in the way that the legal system is or how things are applied in the legal system, I should say. And we got to think, do we always have to throw the full weight of the law behind something? Certainly there are instances where people do something that is so horrendous that it's like, yes, please throw the book at them. But I think we get to this point of where are we willing to accept grace? Or why are we so willing to accept grace and yet we're unwilling to give grace? Jesus gave exceptional grace, we see, throughout his ministry. And yet he did stand firm against people like the Pharisees, who were, it wasn't even necessarily that they were pursuing something wrong, but the way in which they perceived things was not in line with the compassion, with the heart of God that we also see in Christ. God did have punitive things listed out in the law. However, that wasn't the point. The point is holiness, pursuing God. And as Jesus comes, he fulfills what the law never could do, and that is to make righteous those who accept the sacrifice that he made. And we're going to wrap this up here. So he does this healing, and it says then in verse 6 that the Pharisees went out immediately and conspired with the Herodians against him on how to destroy him. And I don't remember how many verses it said, but as I was doing some reading, it's like, we're like 76 verses into the Gospel of Mark. We're just about a quarter of the way in. Not even a quarter of the way in. And they're already trying to kill him. It did not take very long for this idea hey, we need to get rid of Jesus, to pop into their minds. Another thing here, just to kind of point out the hypocrisy that we see in the Pharisees. You think back a little ways when Jesus calls Levi. Okay, in chapter 2, verse 13 to 17. Jesus calls Levi, who is a tax collector, and like we said, he's the worst kind of tax collector because he is a Jew, and he is partnered with the Romans to levy taxes and then be able to take a little bit off of the top, whatever else he can shake out of these individuals. They give Jesus one heck of a time, or even the disciples, just asking, why is he associating with this tax collector? He goes to Levi's house. They go to Levi's house, and they are sitting with more tax collectors and sinners. And when we see that sinners there in that context is talking about Jews that don't hold to the law, or at least don't hold to the law the way that the Pharisees see that it should be interpreted. But these are people that they're like, you're traitors, you're in bed with Rome, don't want anything to do with you. And yet, it says here in verse 6, they're conspiring with the Herodians. Well, Herod is essentially a puppet king who is called the king of the Jews. He has whatever power that the Romans allow him to have, but he's not like this independent king. He is allowed to be there at the grace of Rome, however you want to think about that. And so the fact that they're willing to conspire with the Herodians, man, that stinks of hypocrisy. They were just getting on to Jesus for being with these tax collectors that are sympathetic in a sense to Rome because of the employment that they take on. And then they're conspiring with Herod, who in regular circumstances, normal circumstances, like, I really don't want anything to do with the Herodians. It's a pretty significant thing for them to be willing to meet with them and talk to them and want to do something with them, because again, they're kind of, maybe they're not thought of in quite as bad terms as the tax collectors, but they're certainly not someone that the Pharisees want to have anything to do with. So what do we get from this? Rest is important for man, but it's not so much just for the sake of, you know what, you need to sleep. You need to cease from doing anything active. It's supposed to be a day of holiness, a day that you focus on God, a day to worship, to remember the works that God has done, what you have been blessed with. It was made for man, and it's not supposed to be a straitjacket to handcuff you and keep you from doing good. And Jesus is like, it's good to do these healings on the Sabbath. If I need to have my disciples grab something for sustenance while we're walking down the side of the road, that is fine. You're missing the point. So the legalism of the Pharisees is missing the point of what that shadow that is the law was pointing towards, and that was pointing toward Jesus.